Okay, well, thank you, Kat, for organizing this. I would love to just share sort of like a practice and give us a experimental session on AI chatbots for conflict de-escalation. This project was born out of my time at MIT Sub incubator, which is sort of where I was exploring how we can integrate and intersect the use of digital technology to solving a critical need for more access to justice. Just a little bit about me. I am an advanced commercial mediator, and I created a startup back to me to help mediators after the global pandemic hit, and I was stuck helping judges, retired judges, and practicing ADR practitioners get on Zoom and have a lot of hearings. And it was such a time where we were grasped with the reality of how, the gap and the behind we had in workflows and tools to help us progress and help a lot of people. But there is I guess, growing understanding of access to justice, but beyond the legal aid society. And now we're seeing more of that adoption with big law and mid-sized law firms. But I wanted to present an opportunity here where we look at access to justice beyond charity and a necessity for the work and service of law. And the way I want us to think about this is sort of addressing it as a customer obsession. We are in the service industry, and we need to think about how, with legal services, we're using the concept of customer obsession. Now, what is that? This is something that I guess the pioneers are the biggest e-commerce and organization today, which is Amazon in North America, where we are prioritizing customer needs above everything else. And it's sort of the training we have as lawyers, right? And where we have to put in the best for our client. We have to continuously also innovate to improve that service, which is sort of the concept of customer obsession. Also making decisions that are long-term for customer value and retention, and not just based on demand. So when we think about that, how do we apply that to legal services? So I've broken down some of the concepts true of customer obsession and how that applies to legal services. So accessibility is one of this. How does chatbots provide that for beyond legal aid, but for services that can be easily addressed through quick services? How do we help multilingual communities as such a diverse nation as we are in the United States? How do we also create user-friendly interfaces? Everyone is using a screen right now. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, the data is there are about 1 billion people who have smartphones. And even those that don't have public access to web interfaces. Now, how can we also personalize this? How can we tailor legal advice that can help individual circumstances? How do we use AI-driven case analysis for personalized strategies? How do we also think about communication styles that can match our client preferences? There's also the concept of transparency, which we're huge on in the legal industry. How do we have clear explanation of legal processes and timelines without providing what we know as unauthorized rule of practice? How can we also be upfront about pricing and cost estimates? I think some of us have talked about, the billable hour and how that is an impending progress on the use of technology. We also know that we need regular updates because the law is ever evolving. There's new cases every day that changes one or two things. And also thinking about the efficiency. How do we prepare documentation? How do we help onboarding, case onboarding? How can you create faster resolution through AI-assisted negotiations? Also, another very important thing that you will be surprised takes a huge task is scheduling hearings and important dates, especially within the aspect of alternative dispute resolution, which is kind of what brought about my research and we talked about, again, the service of access to justice, not just as charity. And I wanted to use a very business example for this, which is co-founders. The data as at 2021, when we're working on this, was that the startup industry is $1 trillion industry, and over 500 billion is lost because 60% of startups fail because of co-founder dilemmas. So we took on the Zipcar research, which was a study by Stanford, that looked about how that affects the dynamics of both equity share and as well as interpersonal relationships. So this is an hypothetical scenario that I created where we have 3 co-founders, Ajit, Joy, and Mohammed, who raised about 15 million, and one co-founder wants to go a different go-to-market strategy. Their product has reached a certain level where it needs to be redefined. They need to conquer new markets. Another co-founder doesn't like their strategy, feels like it's going to impede on their revenue. Revenue is so important at the beginning phases of startups. And when you've raised about 15 million, you're in that Series C phase where you have to have a product market fit. Then there's a conflict arising for expansion strategy. There's legal consequences to how to get into those markets. The co-founders can agree. The investors think, well, we need this expansion. We need you to grow revenue so you can raise more, because they have enough investors from the early stage, pre-stage stage, and want to increase their market growth. So because of that, in this hypothetical case, one co-founder is kind of pushed out. This is a case very familiar within the startup world, right? And how do you treat such a case? This sort of case, you would think, well, if you're a startup, you have a lawyer. No, not usually the case. If you're a startup, you're not spending money on such things. And even if you do have a lawyer, you're working primarily on product strategy and business educations like contracts and what have you. How do we use such technology in such a case? Now, I was going to pose a question to the audience, but because of time, I would swing along and see what way can traditional legal service fall short. Now, keep in mind that we have just seen the breakdown of one of the top AI companies last year with some sort of co-founder dilemma with Sam Altman in India. While we don't know the details of that, there's a lot of speculations. But again, you can see that it's not a consideration that traditional services has readily available help for that. Now, I created a framework. We're using mediation techniques, which is what we have: the beginning phase, the middle phase, and the ending phase to every conflict. I also use what is called, and I'll show a bit of that in a second, what is called the dynamical system theory, which it's something that was developed at Columbia. It was a part of Columbia. I think it's the School of Education. I forgot the negotiation. Well, I worked with the faculty, a research faculty, and one of the things about dynamical system theory, it draws analysis on feedback loops, which is also something that was predicted from game theory, where you use stimulations to be able to know what are some of the attractors, both positive and negative attractors, that keeps people in intractable conflict. Now, it's so interesting that this was such a simple framework that could be implemented within a coding system. Yes, you might need a bit of code, but I want us to focus on the framework. Now, in the beginning phases, what you have is something like this. You have user input, right? So going back to our hypothetical dispute, you have Joe and Ajit and Mohammed. They provide their perspective. So you as a mediator, you usually would take in the position, right? Here, what we're training the chatbots to be able to do is to be able to recognize different personas and provide perspective on their concerns based on their context, the true text, or in cases as AI is advancing with voice inputs with AI agents. Now, how do you integrate this persona? When we have a framework where you can identify this conflict identification. So they tell you if I'm not able to show, but some of the work that we did in this framework some of the work I did in this framework was to be able to specifically break down each hypothetical case that might be the perspective or concern of different co-founders based on their persona. And because of time, I would just wrap up these phases so that we can have time to talk about access to justice. And the next phase, we have the middle phase, right? Where you're dealing with the key elements of the conflict. You're mapping the conflict now. You're identifying what are the feedback loops, what are the prompts, and what are some of the explorations to solutions. So now you have what I call conflict categorization. You have shared experiences, you have personal outcomes, you have personnel-based communication. So how do they communicate? What are some of the attractors? Now, if you take a look at this diagram, they're different color coding. And that's because different color codes give you understanding of what are their primary and their secondary issues. This is very important in dynamical system theory because you want to be able to identify what is primary and what is secondary because that allows varying outcomes. Now, this is where we also teach, there's a bit of coding and I'm not able to show you here, but in those code notes, we call them case notes for mediation purposes, is that you can see the loop based on what is positive in blue and what is primary in red. And then these arrows as well indicate—
Within 1 minute.
Oh, the negative
1 minute.
attractors. All right, I'm gonna skip it. I'm gonna briefly talk about the persuasive complex in AI assisted. This is a risk because there's a risk for relating relationships through rewards and feedback. There's a lot of ethical implications within the human-computer bonds and the legal context. Now, we can look at that and we can talk about a lot of the transparency needed for accountability, privacy, the data, what is trained on, what kind of ways are the chatbot trained on, what are some of the data that is being fed to understand different relations and communication style. But we also look about how chatbot can assist in different scenarios beyond this co-founder conflict. Now, these are some vital numbers. In New York, where I've worked at small claims, there are about 3 million cases per year. According to American Bar Association, 2.8 is the average lawyers that are paid to represent 10,000 residents within the United States. But there's only one national service right now that is being administered at the federal level to solve legal services. And there's a definite fact that has been brought about from the Justice Gap report in 2022 that 92% of civil problems are still unaccounted for, especially in rural areas. And we are looking at a solution. How can we measure success? I'm going back to that customer obsession, customer satisfaction scores, reduction in time to resolution, creating numbers of individuals that are accessing legal assistance and still improving the outcome for those who want to go the route of